Forces event. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Helen Walker and I'm the Chief Executive of Carers UK, and I'm delighted to be chairing today. Thank you all for joining us. So firstly, there's a little bit of housekeeping, which is always a bit of a challenge on Teams. We've placed you all on mute to avoid background noise. And please use the chat box to let us know if you're having any technical difficulties or any questions. Today's event will be recorded from when I finish speaking. I'm not quite sure what they've got against me, but it will then be made available to you at a later date. If you would prefer not to be recorded, then please do let us know in the chat box. Most of today's sessions have been pre-recorded, so there isn't an opportunity for questions to be answered until the live Q&A session at the end of the event. Please post all of your questions and comments in the chat box throughout the day, and we'll be collating those and presenting them to our speakers during the final session. Unfortunately, Major General Paul Kane, who was our keynote speaker this morning, is unable to join us for the Q&A session, so we'll be forwarding his questions on to him and get those answers back to you. Importantly, we'll be having breaks at approximately 11:15 and 2 o'clock, and lunch very specifically between 12:10 and 1 o'clock. And we'll be tweeting throughout the event using the hashtag NHSThinkCarer. Before I introduce our first speaker, Neil Churchill, I just wanted to share with you for a couple of moments some thoughts on today's conference and why I'm so personally invested in it. Obviously, I'm Chief Executive of Carers UK, so I have an interest and a passion for making life better for carers. But in a former life, I was Director of Fundraising at SAFA, the Armed Forces charity, and I learned a huge amount about the military and the associated challenges. But it wasn't until I joined Carers UK that I thought about those challenges of caring in the armed forces. And we sat down with a number of the military charities to see how we might work together. And Steve just put the slide up because the first thing we did was to kind of map caring for both those serving and ex-service. And as you can see, the complexity of those different potential caring journeys is huge. And I just wanted to start the day with that, to get everybody thinking about what a significant challenge this is and how very important the work of today's conference is in terms of thinking about where those carers are within these different communities. So that's my starter for 10 and my challenge to you today to really be thinking about where we might find unpaid carers. I now like to introduce you to Dr. Neil Churchill, Director of Experience, Participation and Equalities at NHS England and Improvement, one of the longest job titles ever, I think. Throughout the pandemic, Neil has led support for vulnerable individuals and groups. And yet in more normal times, his focus is on understanding people's experiences of the NHS, involving people and communities in decision making and leading change to improve quality and equality of care. So Neil, over to you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Helen. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? I was a little bit worried earlier today when the storm was raging outside about what it was going to do to my Wi-Fi signal. And my first meeting today, that I was talking to somebody and their lips were not syncing with what I was hearing in my headphones. But things seem to be working well now. So good morning, everybody. And thank you, Helen. And obviously, as well as all the work you do for unpaid carers, you clearly got this long-standing commitment to military families, and really appreciate you giving your time to be with us today. As on so many other occasions, so thank you very much. We did actually record you, I think, so I was thinking maybe I could steal some of your thunder and repeat some of your messages and get the credit for it, but no, we've got you recorded. I think one of the you talked about my official roles and the long job titles, and if anyone's got a suggestion for shorter ones that doesn't upset somebody, then please let me know, because I would like to shorten it. But I think the other reason I'm here is because I'm myself an underpaid carer for my mum. Now, I was for my dad. He died last autumn, but my mum is also very frail, and I'm one of those working carers who tries to support her at a distance. And I think one of the things I've learned in the last few years, which is one of the things that Carers UK has consistently said, is that caring is something that most of us are going to do at one point or another, and sometimes you're doing quite a lot of caring for different people at the same time. And I think that's really underlined today by the NHS staff survey, as an example, which came out at 9:30 this morning, and that showed that a third of NHS staff are also unpaid carers for a family member or a friend or a neighbour due to their age or to their ill health. A third at the moment. So it's an astonishing number, and really shows that understanding carers and supporting carers needs to be something that every organisation can do, and every service can do. But of course, everybody's circumstances are different. Everybody's caring experiences are different. And say I'm a working carer who provides care at a distance of about 25 miles from my mum, and sometimes she is easy to help, and sometimes she's not easy to help. But it's really important that we understand those different circumstances of people providing the care, and that the services we have are they're joined up, they're supportive, they're responsive, and ideally they're proactive in anticipating and meeting people's needs. And we have some way to go to achieve that for most carers, unfortunately, but there are particular groups of carers we've got further to go. And I think, as Helen was highlighting with that map, where there are complexities in people's lives, complexities in people's experiences, you get complexities in services, and that doesn't help. I mean, my other reflection on the last year we've just lived through is that caring just got harder. And it got harder in a number of ways. I think that there's been more for people to do, because people's lives are more difficult, and the pressures have increased. There's been less support available. Quite a lot of the local support organisations have had to change the way they work. Quite a lot, for example, in my mum's case, have gone online. My mum won't go anywhere near the internet. She's got absolutely no interest in doing that. So some things have become less accessible, and some services have been harder to access. And there's been some gains in the move towards digital consultations, for example, but there have been some losses too. And I think one of the big things has been that there's been more anxiety about what's the right thing to do. I think a lot of people like me have been balancing the risk of infection between members of a household bubble with the impact of isolation for prolonged periods on people's mental health and well-being, and trying to think what is the right thing to do, how is the best way of supporting people, and how can I draw on support to make that possible. And clearly, some of the factors you're living with in the armed forces families are going to exacerbate that. You've got some additional anxieties about physical, mental health and well-being. I think there's the impact of moving around. There's the impact of prolonged absences, and the fact that providing consistent and anticipatory proactive care, which is what we aspire to, can be harder in many of those circumstances. So what's the impact of that? Well, we know that the impact of care on of caring on carers is pretty significant, and can be very challenging. We know that carers are less likely to be in good health, whether that's physically, whether that's mentally. We know that carers can feel exhausted, that they can reach crisis points. If they do reach that crisis point, it can lead to a breakdown in their ability to care. It might lead to the carer themselves being taken to hospital. It might lead to the person they're looking after being taken to hospital. And I think we're really conscious that we talk a lot about how NHS staff have stepped up to do more during the pandemic. We also recognise that unpaid carers have stepped up to do a lot more during the pandemic, and it isn't sustainable for it to work like that. And we really need to make sure that unpaid carers are a priority in the recovery of NHS services and other services that hopefully we will see increasingly in coming weeks as infection rates go down. So we're really here as part of the NHS Commitments to Carers programme, which is something that we've been running for a while. And I always think about the goal of this programme in relation to something that somebody said to me at a Carers UK conference a few years ago. And what they said was that it can often feel, if you're an unpaid carer, it can often feel as if the carer is supporting the NHS to support the patient. And what they really want it to feel like is that the NHS is supporting the carer to support the patient. And not just the NHS, it can feel like every different service has got a different relationship and a different person picking up the phone to you and not joining it up. So actually the carer is actually trying to organise all these different services to support the patient without the kind of joined up support that they need. So our job really is to turn that around, so that NHS and other local services are working collectively in a proactive way to support the carer so that they can support the patient. And there's some real specifics that we've got in relation to do that. We've had a lot of focus on the earlier identification of carers so that we know who people are and we can find out what they need, recognising the work that they do, involving people in decision making, and providing appropriate support. Now that might be support, just proactive support to stay well. It's also support when things go wrong, to making sure that people have contingency plans and those contingency plans are acted on. And we're conscious within that we've got a number of groups of carers that we can miss, that can appear to services to be hidden. They might include young carers, they might include carers from some ethnic minorities, where assumptions can be made about what happens in families that aren't necessarily appropriate. And it can involve armed forces carers, because people can be missed between two systems, the armed forces themselves and the universal services, and we need to make sure that those are joined up. And also when people move or when circumstances change, arrangements that have been working can break down. So what we've been trying to do, particularly in this armed forces programme as part of the Commitments to Carers, is to kind of build networks of support, build resilience between those different sectors, between the armed forces communities, between the NHS and other public services, and with families. And we're looking really to learn. There's a lot of learning that is happening that we can bring into the NHS, learning from unpaid carers, learning from people who are working with them, and learning from really good examples of work around the country. And what we really want to do is to improve the support offer, so that we can identify people, support people, and where there is good practice, we spread that good practice fast and make it the norm. So delighted that we're able to be here for this third national conference. I think it was due to be taking place in November last year. It's now March, so it's been delayed, but it hasn't been delayed by as much as some other things. And certainly from our perspective, the NHS Commitments to Carers programme is a vital priority, both in terms of our response to COVID and in our consideration about how can we restore NHS services after the pandemic. And I'm really looking forward to hearing some of the examples of good practice that we're going to be listening to later on. Also particularly grateful to those of you who are going to be sharing your own experiences. I think, again, one of the things I've learned from listening to the Carers Charities is it's important for all of us to talk about what we do in relation to caring, because it makes it the norm within organisations, within families, and it helps to raise the profile of caring within those organisations so that they can be better employers, so that services can be better. So imagine if everybody, if all those third of NHS staff talked about their caring role within their organisations, I think we would see significant improvements in how those organisations supported unpaid carers who are working. So particular thank you to those of you who are sharing your experiences, Joe, Emma and Alan. Looking forward to learning from you and understanding what we need to do. So we recognise that there's some way to go between what people want to be experiencing and what we're currently providing at the moment. Occasions like this are a fantastic opportunity for setting out that learning and raising the bar. And what we will endeavour to do is to go away and act on what we've heard, and to try and make sure that we are really aligning what the armed forces world, the NHS and public services world, and families can do and want to see happen over the next few years to improve people's experiences in real life. So thank you very much. Really pleased to be here. And back to you, Helen.
Thanks, Neil. That's amazing, and quite a statistic from the NHS staff survey. Whilst we're on the subject of numbers and registering as unpaid carers, as a big piece of work we're doing right now about the census, because that's the benchmark for unpaid caring. So obviously, as you all know, in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, it's on the 21st of March. It's question number 24 in England and Wales and number 22 in Northern Ireland. So do encourage everybody to tick that box, because that will really tell us how many people in this country are unpaid carers at the moment. And I think that will be a really important statistic for us to hold many people accountable to making sure we have the right services for unpaid carers. I want to move straight on to Jo Jukes, who is the widow of an army veteran with CPTSD, and also the number of different advisory boards and ambassador roles that she holds, I think just shows a huge commitment to the cause. So I very much look forward to hearing what Jo has to say.
Hi, my name's Jo Jukes, and I'll be talking at the conference about my experiences with my husband, who was Dave Jukes, and he took his life in 2018. He had severe untreated PTSD, which was diagnosed by Combat Stress and other NHS agencies. In the lead up to that, obviously, the end of his life was just a symptom of many years beforehand that went. Kind of all kicked off when he came back from Afghanistan in 2012. He went to the GP within a couple of months, and that wasn't kind of picked up, even though he had a formal diagnosis of PTSD. He went there with symptoms reoccurring. I would say at that point, maybe he should have been kept a little bit more of an eye on. Intervention should have been put in place. There wasn't any follow-up on when he came home to make sure that he was coping with everything and how he was. So it started off in 2012, then continued, and it got worse as time went on. He did engage with services, as many as he could. He went to Combat Stress, he went to PTSD resolution. At no point was he referred by his GP surgery to TILS. I don't know if it was a lack of understanding, or they hadn't really identified that he was a veteran, even though all he ever went with was problems relating to his PTSD. It ended up where, in the end, I had to self-refer him to TILS because I became quite frustrated that things weren't being followed through and he wasn't being given any support. I then contacted my GP surgery and asked them why on his notes he wasn't identified as a veteran. And they said that because they were transitioning over to
Teeny tiny technical problem, but we're on the case.
No matter how many times you practice, there is always something on the day.
Maybe you could like come out of it and then reload it. It might help.
Yeah, I was going to suggest that. I wonder whether just logging out and logging in on the video might bring it back.
If Jo's on the call, Paula, could she perhaps continue live? This happened at a meeting I was on earlier this week.
If she's happy to, we're happy for that. I don't know.
Sorry, Jo, putting you on the spot a bit. No change there then.
Is she on?
I'm happy to speak live. You just have to forgive me. I wasn't
Get you
prepared for
slap
that.
on, Jo.
Where did I get to? I think it was where I had to refer him into tills, wasn't it?
That's right.
Yes, it was.
Yes. So if you're happy to go ahead, thank you. Yeah,
that's fine. I'll put my camera on, so forgive me if I look like I've just been dragged out of bed. But I had to identify Dave as a veteran at the doctor's surgery, because although he was already registered and was going with his problems of PTSD, they were not backtracking for people that were already registered. So they were basically only identifying new veterans. And because it hadn't been brought to their attention, they hadn't quite had the system hadn't quite joined up with each other. So when I went and asked for an emergency appointment for his mental health, I was basically told, no, he's not going to get an emergency appointment. And I said, well, he has a service attributed mental health condition. I'm sure that he should do under the covenant. Well, he's not identified as a veteran. So basically that's how it all then kicked off. And then I put a complaint into the doctor's surgery. From that, I can only praise the doctor's surgery. They really did up their level. I mean, he was given then a named GP, which he found really good for him, because he needed to build a rapport with someone in order for him to relax and feel that he could actually speak to someone openly. She was trained. She knew how to cope with some of his triggers. They came up with a plan so that when he was in the doctor's surgery, one of his things was, because he was ex-military, he hated lateness. He got very anxious when there was a lot of people in a waiting room. And they came up with a plan that when he was like that, he could appear to be quite aggressive and he would get quite anxious. And that came out in certain particular ways that he behaved. He was allowed to walk out of the doctor's surgery at any time if they were late, and it wouldn't be held against him. And then later on, they would phone him up and offer him another appointment. So that was a really good plan moving forward. It was put on all of his medical notes so that everyone knew that if he appeared like this, it wasn't because he was actually aggressive, it was because he had really high anxiety, and everyone kind of understood him. So that's why I would implore anyone to identify themselves as a veteran at the doctor's surgery. If they're not registered, maybe give them some information and say, do you know what, this would really help me if this was put in place for me. Following on from that, one of the things that we found as a family is we were presenting at the doctor's surgery. So for the first time, I had panic attacks in 2016 when Dave's mental health was really starting to deteriorate. I was working full time. It was really impacting on being able to work full time, taking care of him, having children. For the first time, I actually started suffering from anxiety, appearing with panic attacks, go to the doctors, I get given, medication. My daughter is on the autistic spectrum. Her mental health has started to deteriorate. So she was under CAMS already, but she had started to deteriorate at that point. And one of my points is that could be linked up in primary care. So if we had all been identified as, well, we are part of that family, and that family is starting to really struggle with things that are going on at home. So we really need to offer some support here. If someone's presenting all of a sudden with panic attacks, and then one of the children is, and then you've also got the veteran going in who's presenting with mental health problems, that should be linked up. So that was a key part that was missed in offering support for our family. we weren't offered any support as a family to keep our unit together. We were kind of always just left, well, you can just carry on. And a lot of it was focused upon Dave, which of course he's the patient, but primarily we were the carers behind the scene who for 10 minutes a day he might go and see a professional, but we were the ones actually living and breathing that. And that did have an impact upon everyone's mental health within the house. Obviously, as he progressed and he went into crisis, one of the things that we found was I was always at every appointment with him. I was his advocate. I made sure that I spoke on his behalf because he didn't like retelling everything. He found it quite difficult. He had me with him because a lot of the time he couldn't hide things, because if I was there, I was very honest and said, no, that's not how it was. And that was a key part that would help to understand his perspective, but also a key part in offering us some support. But I found that we got marginalised as a family. So if we would say how he's presenting today is not what we see the other 23.5 hours of the day, this is how our life is, honestly. A lot of the times we were ignored. We were kind of like, well, you don't really know what you're talking about because he's saying this. But we did know, we knew a lot more than professionals because we lived with it. And a lot of the time when I asked for him to be assessed under mental health services, or if I asked for an emergency mental health act assessment, I was basically ignored a lot of the time. And I think that became quite frustrating. At his inquest, every single person involved in his care did turn around and say, that, you know, if I'd known the cumulative effects of this mental health, if I'd known the full story of everything that was happening, he should have had a mental health act assessment. And although that was good to hear at an inquest it's too late. So it's about listening to the family beforehand, making sure that you're actually going, yes, well, they have a perspective that would really help us to understand the full situation here. And I think that is what would have helped us. I can only praise Tills. I know that when Dave went to Tills, he came home from that assessment and he said, they understood me. I didn't feel that I wasn't listened to. I didn't feel that I had to hide anything. I had already sent in a statement because I was at work that day when he had his assessment. I sent in a statement giving the family's perspective. So I sent in a 2-page letter. This is what daily life is like for our family. And even now when I read it, it's quite upsetting what we were actually living with. And I don't want that to be blamed on Dave. That's not Dave's fault. Dave was ill. And I understood that. My children understand that. But they needed to know from our point of view what life was like, just in case he sat there and he went, everything's great. She's just a bit batty. I found that Tills openly read that. They took it into consideration. He felt really listened to. Like I said, he was immediately referred to CTS. The CTS psychologist, unfortunately, in our area, we were the last area to have CTS put in place. It came a bit late for Dave. That's not anyone's fault, but she was the only professional that actually, from just one phone call, she only phoned up to make an appointment with him. He was in crisis, and she was so concerned. She was the only professional that phoned up so many people and raised her concern. She phoned the police, she phoned the doctor's surgery, she phoned the home treatment team, the crisis team. And at the inquest, I made a specific mention of her, and I went up to her and I thanked her. And she said to me, but I didn't do anything. I never even met him. I just spoke to him on the phone. I said, you know what you did? You showed you cared. And for anyone in that situation, that's all they want. They want to be heard and they want to feel cared for. And that's what she did. And she made a big impact on me. And I have met her many times since. And I will always say to everyone, Tills is the right place to go, because they do understand. They are not the everyday NHS, they are the specific NHS that understand veterans, and that's the difference I think we need to put out there. So I think I've said everything I needed to say.
Joe, that's amazing, and I can't believe that you came on and did it with, live when you were completely not expecting to. So extra kudos for that, and what an extraordinary story. Thank you so much for stepping in, and we're going to have everything crossed that in the meantime we've managed to resolve the technical hitches behind the scenes. But thank you very much. I've got loads of questions, but I know I can't.
Just forgive me for the way I look, because I wasn't expecting to come on, but hopefully I covered everything I said in the video.
Thank you very much. We look forward to asking you some questions later on in the morning. So that's our first speaker.
My name's Helen Ledbetter. I'm the National Young Carers Lead and Area Manager at the Children's Society, and I manage the National Young Carers Initiative, which has been developing good practice, recognition and support for young carers across England for nearly 2 decades. We campaign for change and promote best practice within central and local government. We enable young carers to have their voices heard by giving them a platform to share their experience and raise awareness about the issues that they face and their priorities. We deliver training consultancy to health and social care providers, education, including higher and academic institutes and more. We advocate with and on behalf of young carers everywhere, and we have a focus on considering the hidden needs of young carers and those who are particularly hard to reach. We've delivered services for young carers and families affected by stigmatised illness such as mental ill health, HIV and substance misuse. We've engaged with Black minority ethnic communities, refugee and asylum seeking families, and we've delivered programmes of work specifically around young carers in armed forces families, which I'm going to tell you about today. Our project looks specifically at the needs of these young carers and families across Hampshire and Wiltshire, but learning was shared nationally. And the aim was to produce information resources specifically for these young carers and their families, to signpost them to further information and advice, and also to inform military welfare and external agency providers with professional development to improve recognition and support for young carers across the tri-services, and share this learning widely. So a young carer is now defined in law, they have been since 2014 under Section 96 of the Children and Families Act. And they're outlined as being a person under the age of 18 who provides or intends to provide care for another person of any age within their family. A key principle is that children should not undertake inappropriate or excessive caring roles that may have an impact upon their own development. And a young carer becomes particularly vulnerable when their caring role risks impacting upon their own emotional or physical well-being and their own prospects and aspirations for future in education, work and later in life. So the Children's Society were funded by NHS England to deliver a research programme evidencing the needs of young carers in armed forces families, and examined the responsibilities of agencies under the Armed Forces Covenant, the Care Act and the Children and Families Act to identify and support young carers and the challenges in implementing this in practice. The programme was informed by young carers themselves and by armed forces personnel from across welfare teams, hive staff and commanders, all who attended workshops to inform delivery. The Children's Society developed communication networks between garrisons and barracks in order to undertake the research and continue to inform on a national platform through strategic groups. So just to outline, there are a number of categories of young carers that we consider to be in place, 3 distinct categories identified as those young carers who may be sole carers, so they have the sole responsibility to provide care for somebody, usually within their family. Supportive carers, those who assist somebody else to care, and sibling carers, those who care for a disabled sibling. It's important to recognise that some young carers may care for more than one person. Responsibilities that they carry out can include practical tasks around the home, physical care for someone with a physical disability, personal care, managing family budgets and finances, could be giving medication, parenting younger siblings, providing emotional support, or providing interpreting, perhaps if English is the second language within the family. Now, the University of Winchester research in 2016 found that there were increased incidences of service children becoming a carer. And our own research at the Children's Society found that young carers in armed forces families are less likely to be identified as young carers and receive less recognition and support than their civilian counterparts. It's estimated that there could be up to 54,000 children in veteran families that have caring responsibilities, and yet are less likely to be engaged with effective support. And as armed forces personnel exit the services and transition into civilian health and social care, the needs of the whole family and the impacts of children who are carers or in a position that they may become a young carer because of that transition, those needs aren't necessarily taken into account. There are distinct rights and duties outlined in the Children and Families Act and the Care Act, which highlight that better, more consolidated rights were needed for young carers and young adult carers. That's that age group between 16 to 24 as they transition to adulthood. Now, the Care Act 2014 requires local authorities to adopt a whole system, whole council, whole family approach, coordinating services and support around the person and their family, and to consider the impact of the care needs of an adult on that family. And the Children and Families Act 2014 details the rights for young carers, including that local authorities must assess whether young carers in their area have support needs, and if so, what those needs are. And therefore, it's the responsibility of the local authority really to decide if any of young carers' needs for support could be prevented by providing services to the person they care for or another member of the young carer's family. In addition to these duties, the Armed Forces Covenant was developed to morally support those currently and historically in the forces and their families, and is about removing disadvantage to ensure armed forces families get the same outcomes as civilian community. However, despite the growing evidence and recognition of young carers and armed forces families, the scale of this issue really remains unknown, and the figures and statistics are piecemeal, and service children experience unique circumstances compared to those in civilian life, including perhaps frequent separation from a parent on deployment to a combat zone, as well as frequently moving home and school. And the SAFA Forces Additional Needs and Disability Forum recognise that the challenges of military life can be greater when a service person or member of their family has a disability or additional needs, including PTSD or mental health needs. Now, despite these changes in legislation and entitlements, and despite the growing evidence and recognition of young carers in armed forces families, the scale of the issue really remains unknown, as I've said. However, in 2015 to 2016, a few years ago now, there were an estimated 75,000 service children in England taking up service pupil premium, but no official data was really held of how many of these children were caring. So, but consultation with young carers services across Hampshire and Wiltshire in areas where there's high population of armed forces communities, such as Fareham and Gosport, Portsmouth, Southampton.
Steve, we've lost the sound again.
It was identified that despite 1/3 of the young people receiving support from the local young carer services, it had not been the Armed Forces Welfare Services or providers that had referred them to the support service. And in fact, the Armed Forces Welfare providers were unlikely to know that children living within those communities, whether they were young carers or not. And mainly the referrals for those young carers into local support had come from school. So what we found through consultation with these young carers in armed forces families was that they may be serving for a parent who's returned from combat and is injured physically or emotionally. The majority of the young people we spoke to were actually caring for the spouse or the parent that was remaining at home who was affected by illness or disability, including acute anxiety or stress perhaps, or caring for a sibling affected by illness or disability. It was also noted that there are a number of young adult carers may themselves be among serving personnel, and identified that they were more likely to kind of drop out of service, and change their career in order to stay home and care for somebody, care for a loved one. Young carers may find continuity of support for themselves or the person they care for is disrupted as they regularly move between barracks, where the serving personnel may have to move for training or deployment, and they may therefore feel more isolated or find it harder to cope without support from extended family or local community networks. And there were difficulties in recognising the impact and need of these young people. We know that caring can affect the young person's physical health and emotional well-being, education, and they may gain lower educational attainment at GCSE level and be less likely to go into education, employment or training from the age of 16 plus. And they may find continuity of support for themselves or the person they care for is often disrupted. Deployment of one parent, the serving personnel, will be an additional impact and may result in the child taking on increased caring responsibilities during that time. These young people can experience increased isolation and loneliness, and service children, it should be recognised, can also be very adaptable and resilient and have pride in their families and their way of life, and we should be recognising the skills, hopes and aspirations they have for the future.
I was in primary school and all the kids were like going out and they were like going out with their friends and going around their friend's house, but I couldn't because I was caring for my mum and making sure that like everything's okay at home. And so I felt so lonely and I felt like I had no one to talk to. I think there isn't enough support out there for people because people focus on the people who are physically hurt. They don't really care or they don't really notice about the people who are mentally hurt. It's important for young carers to speak about what they're going through so that people who are hidden young carers can understand that they're not outcasts and that they're welcome in a space where everyone else is going through the same thing. If young people had the right support they needed, I think that the world would be a lot happier place with children being who they wanted to be.
The evidence shows that being a young carer can impact upon their attendance, attainment, personal development and their own welfare. And that over a quarter miss school or experience difficulty with their education. They may obtain significantly lower attainment at GCSE level. And on average, young carers miss or cut short 48 days of school per year, which is really significant. A quarter say that they are bullied, and 42% say that there's not a particular person within their school specifically who recognises them as being a carer. We found that amongst all agencies and across the Armed Forces Tri-Services, there was really an underlying awareness and acknowledgement of need to identify and support young carers. And consultation and discussions with professionals and welfare providers themselves revealed that many were already working with families who have children who are carers, but they had not recognised their role or how well where to access support for them if they did recognise them as a young carer. And there was a limited understanding or knowledge really of the duties and linking into the local authority and local support services for young carers. And the discussions, as mentioned before, highlighted the fact that some serving personnel themselves, aged 17 to 25, were identified through this work as young adult carers and caring at a distance, and during their own leave for parents or siblings within their family homes. There are comprehensive and single Triforce welfare policies and processes in place, but there's no real evidence of structured policies or specific provision for identifying families where children may be caring or at risk of caring at levels which could impact upon their own well-being. And so there are single service assessment processes in place for family members with additional needs. These did not include any processes for identifying young carers within the families. And apart from a section in the SAFA Families with Additional Needs Foundation Handbook, there's no specific information really for families or young people themselves. And in particular, it was identified that at strategic level and in welfare and education provision, young carers in armed forces families are a particularly hidden group of children and young people. And so really, we need to be ensuring that the tri-service welfare assessments consider the needs of the whole family, including carers and young carers, and whenever possible, ensure that support is in place in a whole family approach. Young carers in armed forces families are able to access mainstream young carers projects within the local community if needed, and that all service children in state schools should be offered training opportunities and the chance to engage with the Young Carers in School Award. That is, the Children's Society and Carers Trust deliver the National Young Carers in Schools programme, which rolls out information resources and an award programme for schools nationally, and those CIS schools should engage with this programme. Health services should be more aware of young carers and know of policies, procedures and resources within the local community. There should be developed an awareness raising programme and training for all welfare staff and community support staff via online training and webinars. And information sharing protocols should be developed and also signed up across multi-agency services, including armed forces welfare providers, in order to ensure that no child falls through the gap in service provision, and that young carers are identified and can access resilience and wellbeing workshops and have their needs met. We know that the physical and mental health of young people can be negatively impacted by caring role, and therefore young carers' own health and wellbeing should be addressed as part of a young carers needs assessment. And as I said, the local authority holds a duty to be offering and providing these needs assessments, and they can also commission this out to a young carers service provider or others. Those needs assessments should also include the young person's consideration of transition to adulthood, also known as a young carers transition assessment. The health needs of armed forces personnel, and that includes reservists and veterans, may significantly affect the mental and physical health of family members, including children, and where there are young carers. And so we really need to be including identification and support of carers and young carers on the agendas of the armed forces health and welfare provider networks. Going forwards, there is a need to have an agreement for effective tri-service data collection to enable the development of suitable services to reach and support families. And some useful actions could be included here, such as including a question about carers and young carers in the tri-service continuous attitude survey set up by the Ministry of Defence, and the annual families FAMCAS survey, and armed forces and reserves surveys. Schools to individually correlate data for service pupils and also those who are young carers. We have put a request to Department for Education that the pupil survey census should be correlating data of those pupils who are young carers, and so that can be correlated across to that data of armed forces pupils within their schools. service pupil information profiles on recording data on family members with additional needs and children who are young carers. And so we really need to be thinking about the wording of how we're recording this data in order to identify the needs of young people. And ask questions to identify any carers and young carers during transition processes for veteran families. Not forgetting that specifically, children don't care in isolation, they care because someone in their family has unmet care needs. And no care package provided by a local authority or other welfare provider for someone with care needs should be depending on children being part of that care package, on children taking on inappropriate care responsibilities within the family. Integrated working is needed to achieve this whole family approach. And so that includes, armed forces welfare providers, as I said, local authority, voluntary and charity sector, education and health, and really recognising that it's everyone's responsibility in order to be identifying and supporting and getting it right for young carers. And so this whole family approach means securing better outcomes for children, young people and families with additional needs by coordinating support they receive from across all services. I wanted to highlight some resources that we have produced that you can find on our website, youngcarer.com. This is a whole family pathway which has been updated in line with recent policy and legislation changes, and is a resource for all practitioners. It's a free online resource that outlines ways of identifying, assessing and supporting and implementing those whole family approaches for young carers and their families, including young carers in armed forces families. And we have additionally published our research on the website Young Carers in Armed Forces Families, free to download, which outlines specific needs, statistics and data that we gathered in for. So I'm going to leave it there because
The thing that I find most beneficial is like the monthly meetups. It's just a place where we can go and talk, because all the people in that room have one thing in common, and that is we care for someone. And it doesn't matter what age they are, how or why they have to care for them, but we all kind of have this mutual understanding that we're all similar. It's made me realise that one, I'm not alone, and that there's other people around my age that's going through a similar thing, and that perhaps more people need to be made aware. There are children who are going unnoticed, and they need the support to speak out and find help and find the guidance that's needed. It does just give you the sense of belonging. It builds sort of your self-esteem up, because you know that there's more people, and that if you need support, there's people there who will listen.
So I'm going to leave it there because I know we're going to have a question and answer session as well, but providing you with my contact details in case you need to get in touch for further support.
What we're going to do now, as I said before, is to about how we can be doing more for people in the military and indeed ex-service to support them on their caring journey. So Emma, please do come onto screen and please tell your story.
Good morning. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi.
So as I was introduced, I'm a warrant officer serving with the military police up in Donington. I've served for 16, coming up 17 years, and have spent the last 5 years in Donington, which was actually a preference because I've got family nearby. And I was posted here in 2015 when I was basically going on to maternity leave with my second child. So probably the most important job I haven't actually mentioned is I do have 2 children, so I'm a mum as well. So probably in some people's opinions more important than being in the army. So Chester, I've got an older boy, Oakley, who is 9, and then I've got Chester, who is 5, coming up 6. So he was born in Telford in 2015, and on day 2, when we were due to be discharged, there appeared to be a problem with his bowel. He had a blocked bowel, so he was taken from Telford to Birmingham Children's Hospital. At this point, he'd become quite sick, and he was diagnosed with a condition called meconium ileus, which is a blocked bowel. So I was finally discharged and moved over to Birmingham with Chester, and he had to go for surgery to try and unblock his bowel. But unfortunately, it wasn't successful straight away. We had a long 3 months or 3.5 months in Birmingham Children's Hospital, and during which time he was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis. Unbeknownst to me, it was in my family, but my husband wasn't aware at the time that it was in his family, and it's a genetic condition that's passed down by both parents. So the 3 months in Birmingham, Shirley was on my maternity leave, so didn't really have any impact at that point on my job or anything. But as a parent, it was obviously a very difficult time. He had numerous surgeries, and eventually we were discharged. We were discharged into the care of our cystic fibrosis team here in Telford, and it's hard to describe. They're part of my family now. I feel like they're extended family. CF is a difficult condition because every person with CF will be affected differently. There isn't a one size fits all. So when it comes to their care, the care that they have to be given is very much dependent on the person that's receiving it. So we had sort of a very steep learning curve on everything that we could and we couldn't do. Simple activities that we wouldn't be allowed to take part in. Not being allowed to mix with other people with CF because 2 people with CF aren't allowed to mix. And then there was learning all of the treatments, the nebulizers, the physio, the medications, and all of those sorts of things. So we moved to our team in Telford. We're under a team of 2 consultants, a dietitian, 2 nurses who are nurse specialists, dietitian, physiotherapist, psychologist, support worker. I think I've mentioned them all. So a very big team, and like I said, now part of our family. The initial 3 months at Birmingham were very difficult because, quite rightly, the decisions weren't down to us. They were up to the surgeons and the doctors, because at that point it was a surgical issue as well. So I felt a little bit like control had been taken away. However, we kind of restored that when we moved back to Telford and came under our CF team. So we had an initial meeting to discuss where we were at, and at that point I had no idea, with all the treatments and everything else, how I would be able to go back to work. My husband was also serving, so I wasn't sure how I was going to juggle all of the treatments, bearing in mind we do an hour in the morning. At the time we were doing an hour at lunchtime and an hour in the afternoon, and that's when he's well. So when he's unwell, that can double, and I couldn't see a way that we would be able to fit all of his care and needs in around both working. So I found that quite difficult to deal with. But his main consultant said on the very first meeting, you will be able to go back to work. It'll be hard work, but you'll be able to do it. And that's where we fit in to try and help you to do that. So every year we have an annual review where we all get to sit down and discuss how the past year went. His first year, other than the 3 months at Birmingham Children's Hospital, he spent a further 16 weeks, I think it was, on and off in Telford Hospital with infections, requiring antibiotics. So we obviously discuss how the previous year has gone and the plans for the upcoming year. I've been fortunate to be trusted to be trained to do pretty much all of Chester's treatments, from his IVs at home, physio. The only thing I think I haven't done is port flushes and things like that, because they like to keep that to someone else that Chester's not going to shout out when he hurts them. So it's all discussed, and every aspect of his care is a joint decision. And I feel it's difficult to explain. means for me that I can continue to do my job. I can work around Chester's needs as much as I can. Clearly his medical needs, etc., come first, but the team will allow the discussions to take place as to when things will best be suited. So if Chester's well, we will have one course of 2 weeks of IVs a year. If he's unwell, then it's more, but the planned IVs is a discussion. When's it going to work for you? When can you take time off? When is it going to impact on holidays or any other activities? And as a team, we kind of work around that. So I feel like I'm part of the team, and putting it into context, as his condition has progressed and other conditions have been diagnosed. He suffers from tracheomalacia as well and laryngeal malacia, which both impact on his CF because they're both respiratory problems. As we've sort of gone through, we've managed to work out between ourselves when's going to be convenient and work around it, which is brilliant, because it means I'm part of the team, I'm helping with the decision making, and because the majority of the care does impact on me, I think they take into account that aspect and they will work with me to work around it. So I feel privileged in that respect, and I know that I'm due to be moving later on this year, and I find that quite daunting because they are part of our family. They're always there when I need them, but they always look out for me and my family as well as Chester. The process of moving is stressful enough as it is in the army, every couple of years having to move. But when you've got 2 children that have got SEND issues, as well as complex medical needs, it's quite stressful. But they've stepped in and they're taking care of the whole medical transfer, which has already started, even though we're not technically moving till July. But again, being involved every step of the way with every decision is very empowering. I guess on top of that, I have to be grateful that I am in a unit where I've been allowed to work around what I need to do to keep both my career and to keep Chester well. So being able to flit in and out to school to go and do IVs when he's on IVs, or to nip out to go and take him to a clinic appointment, or, you know, whatever medical appointments and stuff, there's just never any issue. And I think that makes it so much easier for me. I'm in a good place. Sadly, I know that there's other people that aren't so fortunate, and I know quite a few people that have left the forces or civilian jobs because they've been unable to manage both. But you know, I guess it's a good story. It's for me, it's been a positive experience. I hope it continues to be that way. But I think for me, the most important thing is recognising that as a parent carer, I might not be a medical expert, but I do have the expertise in my own child. And I think being able to have an input and be included in those discussions is very important. And I think that was everything I had to say.
That's amazing, Emma. Thank you so much. You just
No
spoke
problem.
incredibly eloquently. Given that you were expecting to be on a recorded version today, so thank you very much. And actually, really kind of resonates with a lot of things we hear. You know, stats like 600 people a day leave work in order to care because they just can't juggle, and the role that you have, and to be able to juggle the responsibilities that you have, I think is an extraordinary story, and does show that you have got support. The key, I guess, isn't it, is to get that support equal across society and in every role. So that's our job. So it's shouting about good practice, I think. But thank you very much. I'm sure there will be loads of questions for you when you rejoin us this afternoon. So we're going to move straight on, I think, to the next film, which we've got everything crossed is going to work. And this is a sort of a triple act, if you like, of Tracy Park, who's a military carer support lead in Wiltshire, with Helen Goff, the Health and Communities Engagement worker at Carer Support Wiltshire, and Joe Boyd, who is an advanced nurse practitioner from Tidworth Medical Centre. So I'm going to pass over to those and hope that everything works seamlessly up until our lunch break.
Hello, my name is Tracy Park. I'm a military carer support worker for the Courage to Care project for Carer Support Wiltshire. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Courage to Care project, which I work on, before handing you over to Helen, who will talk about the Carer Support Wiltshire GP accreditation scheme, and on to Jo from the Queen Elizabeth Medical Centre in Tidworth. And he's going to talk about how the Med Centre are adapting the scheme to support military carers. So the Courage to Care is an initiative partially funded by a grant from the Armed Forces Covenant Fund. Our aim has been to improve recognition of carers within our military population, and with collaborative working, raising awareness. We are trying to help identify carers in serving military families, and for these carers to identify themselves to us so they can access the support that they may need at any time. In the 2011 census, it found that 6.5 million people in the UK are carers. This is equating to 1 in 10 of the population. However, that was 10 years ago, so obviously that has increased with awareness around the country. We have Carer Support Wiltshire have over 11,000 active carers registered with us, so less than 1 in 4 are actually known to us. We also know that there are 10% of young carers in secondary schools and 8% of children in primary schools are now caring. Nationally, we don't know how many of these are taken at the pupil premium. One of the main reasons we discovered that not many of our military family carers are registered with us was because they were, and in some cases still are, very reluctant to ask for help for fear of jeopardising career prospects. But we do know this attitude is changing with all the awareness of carers and how they're coping in different situations. We also know that as of April 2020, there were 16,650 serving personnel in Wiltshire. So potentially 1,650 of these are actually carers. Since the start of our project, we have had over 100 carers from serving military families registered with us. This is up from only 16 in 2018, but we know we still have a long way to go on this. We've been working very closely with SAFA, Army Welfare Service, the AFF, Parent Carer Council, CAB Carers Project, and other agencies and organisations. I have been attending Armed Forces community events such as Welfare Coffee Mornings, Garrison Commanders, community meetings, AFF, SAFA and FANDAF support groups, and we're able to engage with professionals and carers alike. As a result of this engagement, Carer Support Wiltshire have been awarded the COPSIO membership. Some of the support that we've been providing to carers includes external grants, pampering sessions, training and signposting. And before lockdown, we were actually running 3 carers cafes in Tidworth, Bulford and Larkhill garrisons. We are now offering telephone talking support and virtual support cafes, obviously since the lockdown, and we are still receiving referrals and registrations from carers. Our carers have benefited from external grants, including a £500 towards a university bursary, a £500 respite care, some holiday grants, even flooring, art lessons, counselling, driving lessons, therapy sessions, and pampering sessions. We're also lucky to have recruited a serving Lieutenant Colonel as one of our volunteers, and he has been carrying out carers training awareness in the garrisons for us. Carer Support Wiltshire also run a GP accreditation scheme, and I'm going to pass you over to Helen at the moment to talk a little bit how the scheme supports carers in Wiltshire. I'd also like to mention that I've been working really closely with the Queen Elizabeth Medical Centre in Tidworth, and they have attended some of our support groups, and they are really pioneering some of the work which we are carrying out in our GP surgeries. They're working along with our accreditation framework and hopefully to roll out to the rest of the medical centres in the garrison. But I'll let Jo talk about that as well. In the meantime, I'd like to hand you over to Helen to talk about our Carer Support Wiltshire accreditation scheme. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Helen Goff and I'm Health and Communities Engagement Worker at Carer Support Wiltshire. I oversee the Wiltshire Investors and Carers GP accreditation scheme. I would like to talk to you a bit about the scheme. The scheme was developed in Wiltshire in 2011 by local carers, carer support agencies, members of voluntary sector organisations, representatives from GP practices, NHS Wiltshire and Wiltshire Council. Carer Support Wiltshire took over the coordination of the scheme in 2012, building on the work of the previous working group. This is the 9th year of Carer Support Wiltshire coordinating the scheme. There has been a gradual increase in engagement and submissions during the 8 years, with the majority of GP practices in Wiltshire now engaged with the scheme. During this time, criteria have developed based on examples of best practice, feedback from carers' leads and carers. The aim of an accreditation scheme in Wiltshire was to ensure a more uniform approach supporting carers within GP practices. The criteria are designed to set standards for desired practice, provide this support. The fulfilling of these criteria should enable a GP practice to develop a culture of understanding of carers' issues and needs and address these. The scheme, funded by Wiltshire Council and the local NHS CCG, aims to raise awareness of carers' issues in GP practices and provide a system of awards to recognise their support to carers. There are 3 levels to the awards: Silver, Gold or Gold Plus, and Platinum. Silver level provides the basis for early identification of and support to carers, with emphasis on a nominated carers lead who maintains the carers register. It includes flexibility of appointments for carers and the provision of clear information for them. It also requires the attendance at carers lead meetings and hosting a carer awareness talk for all staff within the practice. Gold level gives a practice the opportunity to demonstrate an advanced level of understanding of carers' issues and an ability to identify carers, focusing on carers' events and carers' clinics. It also asks for an understanding of the particular needs of carers within the area. Gold Plus indicates that a practice has maintained gold level for at least 2 consecutive years. Platinum level builds on the activity to achieve gold level and also requires the practice to actively seek feedback from carers about the support they receive in their caring role and for practices to adjust their practice accordingly. The accreditation year runs from June to June. Criteria are distributed in the autumn and carers' leads work towards a level during that year. A panel made up of carers, NHS and Wiltshire Council commissioners and Carer Support Wiltshire staff considers the submissions and agrees the award levels. In July, an awards evening is held to acknowledge and celebrate the hard work and achievements of the GP practices. Each year, the criteria are reappraised by the panel and changes are made to reflect the changing context of primary care priorities whilst still prioritising support for carers. Due to the introduction of NHS England quality markers for primary care in June 2019, a working group was set up to consider the incorporation of these with the accreditation scheme. This group was made up of members of the panel as well as representatives from GP practices. I had been involved in the development of the quality markers, having a number of communications with Dave Ross at NHS England to discuss the Wiltshire criteria. These quality markers reflect those discussions and include many of the elements of the Wiltshire scheme. In turn, the working group agreed to the introduction of a number of new criteria to correspond with the quality markers. There are clear outcomes for carers from the GP accreditation scheme. The early identification of carers leads to more timely interventions in both health and other aspects of well-being. Within the GP practice, there is more opportunity for preventative healthcare, particularly with flexible appointments, enabling carers to attend more easily, free flu jabs, and carer health checks. Carers often do not prioritise their own health needs. The scheme encourages them to look after their health by attending specific clinics for carers. These combine a 20-minute health check with a 20-minute appointment with a member of Carer Support Wiltshire support staff as a holistic approach to a carer's well-being. This model has led to outcomes for carers in terms of physical and mental health. Carer Support Wiltshire's Social Impact Report 2016-17 recorded that 543 carers were seen in 2016 in GP clinics, of whom 75 were referred for follow-up medical care and 15 were referred for emotional therapy. These improved outcomes for carers in turn have the potential to contribute to priorities for primary care, such as reducing hospital admissions. If the health of the carer is better maintained, there is also a potential cost saving in preventing crises requiring costly interventions. Submissions for last year's accreditation demonstrated that the culture of understanding of carers' issues aimed for is widely achieved across Wiltshire. The majority of carers' leads describe contacting carers at the start of the first lockdown due to COVID-19, recognising they would be particularly affected by the restrictions and offering their support. Many are continuing with this contact. The GP accreditation scheme has provided a framework in which this understanding could develop and a robust method of reinforcing this. It would be great to see a similar scheme at the health centres on the bases in Wiltshire running alongside this and complementing the work of the current scheme.
Hello, my name's Jo Boyd. I'm an advanced nurse practitioner and the carers lead at Queen Elizabeth Memorial Health Centre in Tidworth in Wiltshire. This is part of Defence Medical Services, which covers the Army, the Navy and the Air Force, and our primary role is to protect and restore the health of the UK forces. At Tidworth, we're the largest of all the primary care medical centres and have a population of over 11,000 patients. We see service personnel and their families and provide both GP care and occupational health services. Members of the armed forces are typically younger and fitter than the general population, and we actually only have 7 patients over the age of 60. However, their families and dependents have health needs typical of their age and the general population. The Armed Forces Covenant sets out a framework for the duty of care Britain owes its forces, and one of the key principles is that they experience no disadvantage in accessing comprehensive healthcare. And when we were looking at the needs of our carers, for us it was essential that our patients were offered access to support that was at the very least comparable to that offered by our NHS colleagues. So we began working with Courage to Care and Carer Support Wiltshire towards the end of 2018. And luckily at this time it coincided with the publication of a Ministry of Defence guidance note, identification and support of carers within Defence primary healthcare. And luckily at this time there really appeared to be an appetite to support development of carer services. So we started by looking at our current practice and using the GP framework decided to really focus on 3 key areas. These were the identification of carers, introducing a clinical carer pathway, and then improving access to services within the practice. There were 2 of us initially on the practice carers team, that's myself and a healthcare assistant called Puspa. However, from the start, we really did recognise that we needed a whole practice, multidisciplinary approach to carers. So Carer Support Wiltshire and Courage to Care attended whole practice meetings, outlining the services that were available to us in our local area. and all staff are now able to signpost patients and ask patients if they're carers. When we looked at improving identification of our carers, we recognised that there are the same barriers as the general population, and that's with carers not identifying themselves as being carers, and ambiguity around the role of what actually is a carer. So we started by ensuring that we had really clear definitions. So this was advertised on posters, on notice boards, and on registration documents. We've got large pop-up banners, which were supplied by Courage to Care. That's immediately on entry of the medical centres. And the photos on these banners, quite importantly, reflect our demographic of soldiers and their families, so that they can then relate to that. We also recognised defence-specific barriers to identifying carers, and that was fear of the occupational impact identifying as a carer may have. So to address this, we worked with regimental medical officers, discussing cases and raising awareness at unit meetings. The recent introduction of a uniform champion as well will also really help us to reduce this barrier. So when we looked at introducing a carer pathway to the medical centre, we considered the best way to support our patients and how we could recognise and reduce the health impacts linked to our carers. And compared to non-military practices, our number of carers are small and we have more resources available. So on registration, all patients are asked if they're carers. An information pack is given and an option for an initial telephone consultation or a face-to-face meeting, so the patients can decide which they are more comfortable with. And at this point, we then discuss referral on to our colleagues in the Courage to Care team. Or if any young carers are identified, we support the families to make those referrals. An alert is put on patient records with really clear text, actually informing our admin team what is offered. So patients are offered a same-day appointment if needed and a double appointment if requested. Our patients who are carers are also offered a named clinician to oversee their care and offer this continuity. Their patients can then contact this person via email or directly to that person or via an e-consultation if easier. We offer holistic annual reviews, including mental health questionnaire and flu vaccinations. The carers team hold a virtual carers clinic every 3 months, where the patient's records are monitored, and patients can also opt to have a telephone call every 3 months, just to check in, just to make sure everything's okay. After this clinic, if we identify any concerns or if a patient has raised any concerns, we then discuss it at our vulnerable patients meeting. So this is a multidisciplinary team meeting, which includes the school nursing teams, health visitor and the army welfare teams. So another area that we identified we needed to improve was how we would improve access to health and caring support. Looking at our population, they are very mobile and they can go on postings, they can go on exercise. So we looked at the best way to communicate with our patients. And our biggest success by far was the introduction of text messaging. So we send welcome packs, monthly updates, including links to local resources. Pre-COVID, we would attend the carers cafes with Courage to Care, just meeting the carers there, offering blood pressure checks and being really visible there for health promotion advice if needed. And hopefully, once everything returns to normal, we'll be able to recommence these. So where are we now? So at the beginning of the process, we had 7 patients on our carers register. We now have 35. We've got a structured pathway where patients can choose how much support and input they have from their healthcare professional. But we do recognise we're one small part of a very large support network, and we honestly couldn't have done this without the support and guidance of Courage to Care. As part of the MOD, we don't always have access to the local information. However, this collaboration offers us a bridge to that sharing of good practice. In the short-term future, we really look forward to introducing the GP accreditation framework into Defence Primary Healthcare Medical Centres and with our colleagues across the region, and supporting practices to implement this, because this framework for us was a godsend. You know, it really gave us that structure that we needed. And I think our longer term real hope for the future is that soldiers and families can receive the very highest consistent level of support and guidance wherever they're posted.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to Tracy, Helen and Joe there for a really informative discussion. And I'm sure that there will be a lot of questions. So a reminder, please do put all of your questions into the chat. We're going to be collating those over the next couple of hours, so that when we have that Q&A session this afternoon, that we can ask those questions live. And whilst I'm on the subject of live, excitingly, I think all bar maybe one or possibly two of this afternoon sessions are live. So there should be no opportunity for anything to go wrong. I shouldn't really say that, I know, but fingers crossed, it all seems to be going a little bit more seamlessly now. I think the wind's died down, everything's fine and dandy. Questions in the chat. We are going to return, we're back on time now, so we're going to return at 1 o'clock, please. 1 o'clock, so you've got 51 minutes to have some lunch, and then we'll be returning with Sue Libbard immediately after lunch at 1 o'clock. So I look forward to seeing you all then, and to reading your questions in the meantime. Well, hi everyone, welcome back. I hope you all had a really nice lunch. I hope you all had some time to sort of absorb some of what we heard this morning, and I for one have certainly been thinking about lots of questions. So please do carry on putting your questions in the chat box as we go through the afternoon. Now, I said that a lot of our afternoon sessions were going to be live. Sue Libbard has agreed to do hers live, even though she's already recorded it for us, just to make sure that there are no errors and challenges. So her slides will be going up imminently, and Sue, I hope is on the call already. And will be joining us. She is the BAME lead for the Armed Forces Patient and Public Voice Advisory Group. So Sue, are you there?
Hello, Helen. Yes, I'm here.
Oh, phew, you are. Thank goodness. Sue, it's all over to you.
Thank you. Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a genuine pleasure to be here, and over the next, I don't know, 10 or 15 minutes or so, I want to engage you actually in a thought experiment, because I don't know about you, but I attend conferences fairly regularly, and what happens is I make loads of notes. I mean, I have been absolutely scribbling throughout this morning. Absolute gems, from people I'm thinking, right, I need to connect with them. I need to find out a little bit more here. Statistics, data. Absolutely fabulous. But one of the challenges that I have, and I know a lot of other people have, is that you walk away from an experience, an event like today, and you do oh my gosh, what am I actually going to do with some of these nuggets? What am I going to do with some of this wisdom? So that's why I want to engage you in a thought experiment. So next slide, please. Can I move the slides on? No, that's all right. So I'll just do next slides. Well, you've heard a little bit about me, so let's just move on. I know who I am, and if you want to find out a little bit about me, go onto LinkedIn or Google me or sueliber.com. All right, let's get to our thought experiment. So next slide, please. Thank you. So the thought experiment is this. I want to see if we can create what is called a positive or constructive trophic cascade, and I'm going to explain trophic cascade in a short while, but what I want to do is give some underpinning thought around what a trophic cascade is and what this sitting right at the heart of this thought experiment. So next slide, please. So right at the heart of this experiment, this thought experiment, is the power of small. And the thing about the power of small is that it comes out of the thinking around marginal gains theory. I get an opportunity to work with high-performing teams in organisations. I've worked with people in the sports arena, for example. And one of the things that we really tap into is how small actions, small changes can lead to big results. So we talk about marginal gains. What are the small things that people can do? And when lots of people are doing lots of small things, then what happens is that coalesces and big change can happen. So in our thought experiment, I'm very much asking you to think about some of the small things you can do as a result of what you've heard this morning and what I'm going to be saying. So I'm asking you to think differently as a result of being here today so that you do some things differently. All right. So next slide, please. And right at the heart of us being able to do this, engage in creating trophic cascades and engaging in taking and squeezing the juice out of what we've managed to hear and learn today, is the fact that we all have a hierarchy bias. We live in the world of hierarchies. And I'm going to ask you to give some real thought to where those hierarchies are in play in terms of your personal and your professional life. So I don't know about you, every which way we look, we see hierarchies, whether we're talking about, travel, when we're allowed to do that, of course, whether we're on a plane, whether we're on a train, we have first class and we have economy. When you look at the hospital system, and as a former nurse and as a former midwife, one of the things I've certainly found in my experience, there are hierarchies within the NHS. So when we look at the doctor cadre, we've got, the consultant at the top, senior registrar, house officers. When we then look at nurses and midwives, then we have the allied services, our physiotherapists, our radiographers, our pharmacists, for example. And then somewhere down the bottom, we've got healthcare assistants, and we have then in health and social care, then we move then to our carers. There is a hierarchy. We see it obviously in our armed forces community. We all talk about it and we use the same language. We talk about those that are serving, then we go reservists, then we go veterans, then we go dependents, then we go carers. So we're always talking in hierarchies. So the thing about a hierarchy bias is this: when you're nearer the top of a hierarchy, what we have a tendency to do is give more credibility, more credence, more value to the opinion of people who are at the top of the hierarchy. And that I am challenging you as a result of our time today to give some thought to. All right. Because the reality is, that is not the truth. Is not primary or prime that people who sit at the top of the hierarchy have the most knowledge and have the most expertise or have the best wisdom. Far from it. So one of the things in our experiment is I need us to be aware of hierarchy bias. But what if we flip the switch? Can I have the next slide, please? What would happen if we took a leaf out of nature's playbook? Because nature doesn't think about hierarchies. There is a lot around ecosystems, equal but different. So you can see on the slide here, when I'm talking about ecosystems, I'm talking about lots of separate elements coming together, interconnected, and interacting to create a whole. And obviously I've got a picture of a tree here. Just as as an example, we know that for any tree to thrive or to survive, it needs a series of elements. It needs the sunshine, it needs water, it needs insects, it needs birds, to pollinate and move its seeds around. It needs fertile soil in which to grow. It communicates with other trees, so it needs a good root system. It needs moss, actually. I was mindful I was doing my lawn at the weekend, which was really very mossy, and I had to remind myself that is part of an ecosystem, so give some thought to that. All right. So why am I talking about ecosystems? We in the armed forces community have a very, very complicated, complex ecosystem. Equal but different, remember, this is the key thing. So could I have the next slide, please? So in our ecosystem, if you think about it, the complexity that we've got commissioners of care and health and social care services. We've got deliverers, direct care providers, of course, and we've been hearing from some of those people throughout today. We've got organisations as well as individuals who are supporters of carers. We've got the provider organisations, the sources of caring services, and of course we've got the service users and the beneficiaries. We also have, you know, our partners. You know, you think about it, we've got the NHS, of course, local council, we may have social workers, we've got educational professionals, we've got charity, we've got voluntary sector. So our ecosystem when it comes to health and well-being for anybody that's in a caring role within our armed forces community has high levels of complexity. Now, like every ecosystem, is that if we then look to change one aspect of that ecosystem, so we remove an item, or we add an item, or remove an element, or add an element, what can happen is we can find ourselves that we create a cascade of change. We heard beautifully from Emma earlier today, you know, our military police colleague, talking about a beautiful ecosystem in terms of, you know, support for her family and particularly for her son. And what we've got is, you know, Emma potentially being posted, and what's that going to do in terms of that ecosystem? It will set up a whole cascade in terms of the support that her family is receiving. So that's what I'm talking about here when I talk about cascades. Next slide, please. So I keep mentioning the phrase cascade, I keep talking about trophic cascades, and these really are an important lens, I think, for us to look through, and particularly as we are talking about our thought experiment, how we're going to squeeze the juice out of today and some of the key learning and the key advice that we've been given. So as you know, the descriptor says right there on the slide, a cascade is an event that creates changes to the structure of an ecosystem. And I've got a visual there in terms of, you know, a timepiece. We know all the intricate workings. It works together. You take one piece out, you take a cog out, you take a you know, a pin out, and the whole thing can grind to a halt. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of our system. Next slide, please. So my question is this: what if we had no carers in our armed forces community? I mean, I don't know about you, but for me, that is potentially quite alarming. You know, we'd have overburdened other systems, possibly. We would have absolutely, you know, failing support mechanisms. We would have, you know, high levels of detriment to our beneficiaries of the support that we're trying to provide. And, you know, what we were hearing earlier, I go back to, you know, being terribly moved again when I listened to Joe Jukes this morning, talking about, you know, access and support in terms of the system, you know, decisions being made later after an effect. So just give some thought to this particular question. What would happen if we had no carers within our system? Like I say, almost unimaginable. So as a consequence to this question for me, it's really important, therefore, that we access the voice and the opinions of everybody in our ecosystem. So if you are a commissioner of care, then it's really important, we know this, to access the silent minority. And we were hearing particularly earlier from the Children's Society, when we were talking about our young carers, sometimes invisible, sometimes not noticed, not being able necessarily to find their voice. So really, really important that we listen to all aspects and all partners in our ecosystem. So like I say, as commissioners, we have we have a duty to be able to implement mechanisms whereby we access that particular voice. People who are providing direct care, it is really, really important. And we've heard some of this, and this is just about you refreshing and you rethinking for us to check in and to encourage carers to speak up and speak out. Opinions matter. Opinions shape service and shape support. And for those of us that are, you know, in a supporting role, whether that's personally or whether that is professionally or for the organisations that we're in, again, accessing the true voice is really important. And like I say, every voice matters in our ecosystem. The truth matters in our ecosystem. So we need to be careful, come back to our hierarchies versus our ecosystem. If we've got hierarchy bias, sometimes what happens is our agenda and not necessarily the beneficiary's agenda or the carer's agenda. So as we're thinking, or you're thinking about what are the small actions that you can do to create a trophic cascade that is positive, what are some of the things you can do to make sure that you leverage or you amplify, you truly listen to the voice of people in our ecosystem? So what part can you play in refreshing our ecosystem? Next slide, please. And this does not have to be huge. This is the key thing. For me personally, I'm going to share one of the things that I personally do. This is just personal to me, with the various hats that I sit on. And as you know, Helen in her intro was explaining, I have an opportunity to influence at a range of different levels. And I use this mnemonic. So when I am in my volunteering work, for example, when I am looking after older veterans, and when I say older veterans, I just, you know, I check in on them. We're talking about veterans who are 90 years plus independent living. One of the things I do is I absolutely pay attention. I take time to notice. And I am conscious of my own personal biases, my own personal bias, particularly my confirmation bias. So when I walk in, or recently, obviously more so when we're on Zoom, I take time to notice, pay attention to what I'm seeing in front of me, but also to what is being said, but more importantly is what's not being said. My R in my trees is to remind myself to be respectful at all times. Now, forgive me, I'm not looking to insult anybody or treat granny to suck eggs, but sometimes what I find, and in my experience and my lived experience over the years, is sometimes I come in with my agenda and I look at how things are being done and I think, no, that's not how I would do it. This is the right way to do it. But if the outcome is safe and the outcome is delivering particular results, I am respectful of that. It's not for me to come in with my hierarchy of values, my hierarchy of opinion, my hierarchy of views, to disrespect something that is happening and is delivering results. My first E in my trophic cascade is to inquire all of the time. I inquire, is everything all right? And I do it from a place of, not because it's a tick box, I do it from a place of genuine interest and genuine curiosity. So when I pause and I stop and I ask that question, it is phenomenal what then emerges, particularly when I'm talking about younger generation as well as the older generation. Taking time to absolutely acknowledge and ask the question, is everything all right? And taking the time to listen to the response, because that then can inform support, advice, guidance, and signposting. My final E is equal, not hierarchical, and that speaks right to the piece I'm talking about, is beware of the hierarchy, think more about ecosystem. We're all players in this ecosystem of ours. We've all got our part to play, and that no person or no organisation is better than. It's an integral part. So I remind myself of equal, not hierarchical. And I popped a little S up there, and that's just a little nod to myself. And that is, can I lead people a little bit more uplifted, a little bit better, with a little bit of a smile, a little bit of a human contact? Can I manage to do that in all of my interactions? And I mean those interactions, whether I am sitting on the board as a non-exec director of NHS Lincolnshire Clinical Commissioning Group, or whether or not it is me with my ethnic minority lead in the Armed Forces Public Patient Voice Advisory Group. Can I leave an experience that little bit better, leave people a little bit more positive, a little bit more uplifted? Next slide, please. So this is my final slide. So this is my challenge to you. This is my ask of you. So as we go through today and we squeeze the juice out of every single speaker that we've had and those coming this afternoon, I leave you with this request. What's the small thing that you can do? Because if every single one of us does something different as a result of being here today, we will create a positive, and I've noticed I've got two A's there, positive and constructive trophic cascade. So what are you going to do differently to ensure that the health and well-being of our carers community is one that is healthy, nurturing and thrives? Thank you. Back to you, Helen.
Oh, thanks, Sue. Wow, tell you what, that wasn't the graveyard slot, was it? Straight after lunch. That's really incredibly inspiring, and I am so pleased that you did it live and you were able to challenge us. I have never heard the phrase trophic cascade, so I will be using that at every available opportunity. But I would say, actually, I came into the charity sector, I guess, with the fundamental belief that you can change the world one life at a time, and sometimes you have to. We all want to make big change, but actually we can make big change with small change if we all do it. So I certainly came away incredibly inspired from that, and I'm sure that there will be billions of questions in the chat ready for our Q&A session later on at 3 o'clock. So thank you very much, Sue. I'm going to move straight on to our next live speaker, who is Surgeon Commander Alan Bowie, who's the Principal Medical Officer at HMS Nelson Medical Facility. And I'm hoping Alan's here. And I understand that he is going to be speaking about his own caring experiences. So, Alan, are you there?
I am. Hopefully you can all hear me. Fantastic.
Yes, we can all hear you, and we can see you now as well. Brilliant.
Even better. Well, probably even better. Thank you very much. I'm going to be slightly naughty because having failed with the technology to pre-record a message, which was very much about a carer's perspective, I'd like, if I may, to go a little off-piste because very much as Sue has been doing, I've spent the morning taking notes and paying attention to what people have been saying. So I'd just like to try to sort of reflect on my carer's perspective, reflect a little on my role as the chair of the Forces Additional Needs and Disabilities Forum, FANDEF, that we've heard a little bit about already, and already heard from Emma, one of our members, and try to pull together some of the ideas that we've already heard. So I hope it's not bad if I go too far off piece. So I'm chair of FANDEF, have been a member of the committee for around 5 or 6 years. And that's because my wife and I have two boys with varying levels of disability. My day job is as the Principal Medical Officer, the Senior GP, here at HMS Nelson, the naval base in Portsmouth. So I also see a lot of the impact of carer responsibilities on our personnel, on their own health, on their family's health. I've been really pleased to see, and it very much fits with what the General was saying and what other people have been saying, that the awareness of the needs of carers is getting more and more to the forefront. I've been looking at some of the sidebar chat, and I know that Isa Gill, former chair of FANDEF, really didn't feel that her status as a carer was recognised when her husband was serving in the military. It's only really over the past 18 months here at HMS Nelson that we've been pushing to recognise people as carers, to get them registered on our computer system. And I think that while it's a shame it's taken a long time to catch up, that's indicative of the way that the forces are now treating carers, that we are trying very hard to recognise the additional needs, if that's not too bad a phrase, that carers have. It's still not perfect, and that invisibility of carers isn't unique to the military. Despite the fact that she is a carer for our disabled son, my 16-year-old son, who has autism, went for his COVID jab 2 weeks ago. My wife is his carer, but she's not a paid carer, so she wasn't able to access her immunisation for a COVID jab, just because of the technicalities. So there are still problems with the way that that hidden status can really get in our way. I was very, very interested by some of Sue's comments about the ecosystem and about the TREE acronym. One of the big things that FANDEF do is we act as the communication conduit between our membership and the various subject matter experts within the MOD. Primarily that's from housing, from education, from the various welfare groups. But we try very hard to have a little bit of distance so that it allows us to have that that respect, because we're a little bit separate from the issues. I know, speaking to some of our SMEs, that when we have our biannual conferences, the next one's October, incidentally, for anybody that's interested, we had to reschedule from June 2020 because there was something happening. Can't remember, can't mean anything important. But one of the things that our SMEs found that they value having the ability of the FANDEF committee to take issues to them, but not to be in their face in the way that you can imagine the very emotive topic of housing, of schooling, of problems like that would be if people had that access in an unfiltered way. I've also been very, very interested to hear about the hierarchical thing that was mentioned by Sue. Clearly, in the military, we pretty much invented hierarchies. We're all sitting in uniforms. We know our place. And that still has a problem when it comes to the sort of services that our carers can access. I'm very lucky. I live in a married quarter with 4 bedrooms. So we have the ability to have a live-in carer. I didn't get that married quarter with 4 bedrooms because of my son's problems. I got it because it came with the job, it came with the rank. I know that if I was an able seaman or a private soldier, it would be much more of a fight just to get that same level of support and that same level of care. So the hierarchy still has a little bit of work to do, I'm sorry to say. The past 2 years has been very, very exciting in terms of the recognition of carers within the MOD. About 18 months ago now, one of the FANDEF members, Michelle, was integral to developing a fantastic piece of research, which has now been published as the 30th anniversary work for FANDEF, and that is called Families Fighting On. Came up with some very, very good conclusions, but she also found some interesting things which chime with what we've heard today. One of those being, we don't know what the landscape of need is. People are reticent to come forward and be identified as carers. They think that it might damage their career. They think that it might cause them problems. There were also a lot of problems around that isolation that we heard from the General. It's not possible for a lot of service families to ask grandma to come and do some childcare so that they can have some time, because grandma might be in North Wales while the family are based in the south of England. It's quite isolating. And that was something that Michelle picked up. It was also very exciting to see the report last year by the MP Andrew Selous, the In Our Shoes report. While that wasn't specifically dealing around the issues of care and caring and disability, there's a lot of crossover and some good things coming from there. And the final exciting thing over the past 2 years has been really the exponential growth of the organisation CANDID, the Chronic Conditions and Disease in Defence. A fantastically energetic, engaged team. And they really have got that ecosystem thing absolutely nailed. Every week, a new CANDID subcommittee seems to spring up for every condition you could think of, every service you could think of, getting into the veteran space, the carer space. Their energy just leaves me standing. They are absolutely fantastic. If we don't hear directly from CANDID today, I know that you will hear a lot more from them in the coming months and in the coming years. My final comment really is specifically something that came up from Joe Dukes this morning, and it's something that I hope the three services are looking at, but certainly the Navy are very concerned about mental well-being, both for serving personnel and for veterans. We recognise that the TILS service is very good once you can get the links and once you can get in. And actually my next job is a newly established post in the headquarters, looking to try to bring that sort of mental health and mental well-being thing as an integrated package. Hopefully, if that takes off for the Navy, we'll see that from the other services. So that's my not entirely what you were expecting presentation, but I hope it's useful and gets some generating the discussion. Thank you.
Alan, that's hugely useful and also has saved me a job of doing a synopsis of the day at the end. Incredibly interesting. And if I might just, when you noted your wife wasn't able to get a vaccine because as his unpaid carer, unpaid carers are now in priority 6. And so you should be able to get a vaccine. The SOPs came out this week, so we've worked really hard with lots of different groups of people to get that status for unpaid carers. So I'm sorry that she wasn't able to get it at that time. I hope she can get it subsequently by showing that she is an unpaid carer. I'm going to move seamlessly on to our next 2 speakers. The first is Andrea Collins, who is the Head of Communications and Engagement, Health and Justice, Armed Forces and Sexual Assault Services, NHS England and NHS Improvement. And I thought that Neil Churchill had a long title, but that's incredible. And Andrea, I believe, is going to be speaking live and will be joined later on by Isa Gill. So Andrea, are you with us?
I am indeed. Hello.
Excellent. Hi.
Hello, thank you for having me, and I'm glad you said my job title rather than me having to say it. It is a bit of a mouthful, and I'm part of the national NHS England team, which is headed up by Kate Davis, which many of you, I'm sure, will know. So I'm going to talk about an Armed Forces Families engagement we undertook towards the end of last year across England, and that was to identify how we can improve care and support for Armed Forces families. And I have some slides if they could be brought up on the screen, please. Otherwise I can share mine if that's a problem.
I think they're on their way, Andrea.
Okay.
We're just working a little bit behind the scenes to make that happen.
Okay, no problem. So just to put things into perspective with this engagement. So a few years ago now, we published, the NHS published the long-term plan, which is a 10-year plan for the NHS, which sets out commitments that we need to undertake. And as part of that, there are a number of commitments in relation to the armed forces community, and that's around improving care and support for veterans and their families, families as they transition out of the forces, and also for families and veterans who are accessing NHS GPs. So underpinning the NHS long-term plan is healthcare for the armed forces community, a forward view. Now that was published last Thursday, so not everyone may be aware of that, but we can share the link. That sets out 9 commitments for the NHS in terms of improving health and care for the armed forces community. And commitment 2 of that document is around supporting the health needs of serving veteran and reservist families, including carers, children and young people. So I just wanted to set the scene there in terms.
Andrea, can I forgive me for interrupting?
Yes.
Would you be able to share your slides directly on your screen? Because something seems to have gone a little bit awry behind the scenes here.
No problem. I will do that.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. Just bear with me a minute.
Brilliant.
Okay, and just try and get that on slide. It is actually showing a slideshow because for some reason it's not letting me. Okay, I think. Are we on slideshow now? Excellent. Okay. So yes, so I just wanted to give you that overview to set things in perspective for the engagement. So the reason we undertook this engagement is because for the last few years, and actually beyond that, we are hearing time and time again from families of serving personnel and veterans of the issues they face. And now there's a summary of them up here, and I don't think there's any surprises to people. Many of these issues have been raised today, and that's ranging from coping alone, the stigma around accessing care. General Kane mentioned that earlier, care coordination, continuity of care when you're moving around, the list goes on. And that's something that we needed to explore to see what we could do to make things better. Now, in terms of the conversations we've been having with families prior to the engagement and with the organisation supporting them, one of the things came up was to set up some sort of support network to help address these issues. And what that would mean is different organisations coming together across different sectors, so health and social care, armed forces charities, other charities, to work together and with families to provide a single point of contact, that care coordination, organisations who understand the needs of armed forces families and can support them through their journey to get the right care and support for their health and well-being needs. And a big thing which was coming through was for families not having to keep repeating their story, which was something that Joe mentioned earlier, that the frustration around that and being bounced around from organisation to organisation was significant. So that very much was the premise for us undertaking the engagement. And it actually happened a lot later than we anticipated because of COVID, as many things, it slipped back. It ran from last September for 2 months, and to help us develop the engagement and all the materials in support of that, what we did was pull together an engagement working group, which was a number of members of the NHS England Armed Forces Patient and Public Voice Group, which is chaired by Nikki Murdoch, who's with us today as part of the attendees. So the engagement working group comprised family members from the serving community, from the veteran community. We had families federations representatives on there, and the MOD, and their involvement from the outset was critical to make sure that we were developing a questionnaire that was asking the right sorts of questions to dig deeper into these issues that we were hearing about in a language and a way which was accessible, which resonated, and which would encourage people to come forward. So we had to completely change the whole approach to the engagement, what with all the lockdown restrictions. So everything moved online. We had an online questionnaire, but people could request hard copies if they wanted. We held online focus groups. Some of those were held by the families federations. We undertook an awful lot of social media activity and advertising via Facebook and Instagram. And we developed an engagement toolkit which comprised social media graphics, newsletter copy, etc., which we sent out to well over 160 organisations to help get the word out there, to encourage people to take part and to hear from as many people as possible. And in terms of who we heard from, although we were looking to understand how we could improve the NHS in England for armed forces families, we wanted to hear from anyone, because we were well aware that there would be people overseas who at some point will be coming back to England and who in the past may well have had experiences with the NHS. So we heard from nearly 1,400 people, and as part of that we held 11 focus groups. Most of the responses came back via online survey, and then we reached an awful lot of people, as you can see, via social media and advertising as well. In terms of who we heard from, the largest respondent group was from veterans. Now, veterans were responding in relation to the health needs of their families, not in relation to their needs. Many of those veterans were accessing NHS care and support, in particularly the Veterans Mental Health Services. And we had a good response rate from armed forces families, and that was a mix of serving and veteran families and reservist families. Not so many responses from children and young people. And when we look at the response rate across each of the services, I don't think that's any surprises that in the main we heard from those who are affiliated with the Army. So the key findings very much substantiated what we were hearing prior to launching the engagement when we were having individual conversations with different families. And what came through across all the respondent groups are those items which are on the screen in front of you now, is about that improved information and having that dedicated support, supporting with continuity of care, that practice, good practice, although it's out there, it's variable across England. And if you move in every few years, that's no good. People do not want to have to go to the bottom of waiting lists and have problems with accessing dentistry in particular came up as a key issue, and children, young people, mental health services as well. The other issue was where there were organisations often good at signposting, but not in terms of taking responsibility. So that takes us back to the issue where people are being bounced around because organisations are telling them to speak to somebody else, and that frustration starts to increase. It impacts their health and well-being. They're having to repeat their stories and so on. So in the main, people were very supported about setting up the Armed Forces Family Support Networks. There wasn't any preference whether or not these should be national networks or regional or local. But what people did say is they need to be consistently provided across England. It's no good if we've got networks, if one network in one place offers something and then you move to another area and it's completely different provision. The two top areas of focus and importance for people, if we do go ahead and set up these networks, was to provide a point of contact for armed forces families and to work with armed forces families on their journey through health and wellbeing care and support, to understand the challenges and issues they face and to hold their hand and to act as that point of contact and care coordinator. There are a number of benefits that people thought would be associated with setting up the armed forces networks. Again, I think all the things we would want to see here is about people working within a network across organisations where they understand the military lifestyle, they understand the health and wellbeing needs of families and what it means to be part of the armed forces community, and that they are helping families to understand and navigate the NHS and to make them aware of what is available to them, and very much improving that patient experience and providing that point of contact for them. And outside of the chain of command, what came across as quite important was to have that separate point of contact outside of the MOD, outside of DMS, it is separate from their partner's career pathway, and with no information getting back because of that concern over the serving member's career if anything came up in relation to a health problem. There were a number of challenges which people thought could arise if we did go ahead and set up armed forces families networks. So that was about getting buy-in from organisations, the funding, where would that come from, what would happen in the short and long term. Another point which came across quite a lot was, yes, it's all very good to have this network, but you need to make sure you raise awareness of it, and you need to build trust amongst armed forces families so they feel confident talking to people across the network, and in terms of opening up and sharing their experiences and asking somebody to help them, because we know people don't always come forward to seek that help and support. Another area that was particularly important was, if you're bringing organisations together, they need to work collaboratively, not duplicate and not be in competition with each other, which we can often see. So there were a number of recommendations for the NHS, which we are taking forward already. So improving understanding across the NHS of military life and culture, in particularly amongst GPs, because they are often the first point of contact for armed forces families, as they are for many of our populations and communities. We need to make sure that services are available and accessible to meet the health needs of armed forces families, with staff understanding their health needs and able to support them appropriately. The recommendation was to set up and establish these support networks, and in doing so we need to make sure that we have accessible information for families and are communicating that, and that we're dealing with this issue of the transferring of medical records, whether that's when you're moving back into the country, when you're moving within the country, or you're moving out of military life. It's absolutely critical that we get that right, and that we're encouraging NHS staff to proactively ask people if they're a member of an armed forces family, and they're coding that information. So all healthcare staff are well aware of that important piece of information to make sure armed forces families are getting the best care and support. So in terms of our next steps, so we haven't yet published the report. So this is the first time we have talked about the findings today. So you are getting a snapshot of what is in it. Now, that will be published in due course, I'm hoping over the next month or so, but we will ensure that you get a copy of that. What we have agreed in the meantime, though, is that the NHS will fund the setup of Armed Forces Family Support Networks. Now, what that looks like, I can't say at the moment. That's not something that we can agree and do by ourselves. So we will be taking the development of those networks forward, working together with our patient group, with the families federations, with the MOD, and most importantly, people with lived experience. And that's going to take some time to look at what that will mean, how we set it up, and what we are thinking from what has come back from the Armed Forces families engagement, and what is happening very effectively in Kent, Surrey and Sussex with their armed forces network, is that networks are going to be best placed, set up locally, which supports the direction the NHS is going in with integrated care systems, which some of you may have heard of, which is very much moving that care and support down to local communities to manage. We are also building on existing training programmes that we have for NHS clinicians and staff to increase understanding of armed forces families' needs and the specific services available to them, and to encourage staff to identify and code this patient group. We are in the process of developing a range of communications, not only for the NHS on armed forces families and things to consider and to support them with and to be mindful of, but also for armed forces families in terms of helping their understanding of the NHS and accessing support. And then just to bring everything back to when I started, all of this is being progressed in line with the commitments of the NHS long-term plan and the forward view that we published last week. So I'm now going to hand over to Isa Gill. And Isa is a member of our National Armed Forces Patient and Public Voice group, and she also sat on the engagement working group for the engagement. So she's been involved in this from the outset, helping us to develop everything. And she's going to talk about that from her perspective and also her views on the network. And not to forget, she is also a former chair of FANDAF as well. So over to you, Isa. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. Good afternoon. So Isa Gill, I'm an army wife and mother of a child with autism. He's actually not a child, he's now 20, but nonetheless, that's how I've got involved in all these sort of things. If anybody was at the first Armed Forces Carers Conference, you may have seen me, I hope you don't remember, not able to finish my carer's perspective because I got too emotional. Today, I'm not talking about myself, so no, not even tissues to hand. So I'm a member of the NHS PPV and a former chair of FANDAF, so lots of experience in hearing from other people and getting involved with the discussions. It's been great to be involved with the Armed Forces PPV. It enables us to have a direct discussion about highlighting the issues which service families have with medical care. It often falls to the service member's spouse to organise medical care for the rest of the family, because the serving person has their own medical support network with Defence Medical Services, and it's often, well, especially if there's an additional need or a long-term illness involved, it can take up an awful lot of time. Through the PPV, we've enabled to share, carers have been able to share their experiences so that the NHS people who make the policy and set these things up are able to see how military life impacts on our medical care and be able to discuss how to improve it. Some people absolutely get it, the fact that we move frequently, we have very little notice and very little control over where we go. the frequency of moves and lack of choice can make it very difficult, and that's why I think we welcome some of the initiatives that Andrea spoke about. The family's engagement allowed a whole raft of people to have their say, and running that last autumn was great. It gave a wider audience a chance to inform the NHS of life as a military family. The findings that Andrea outlined from the survey actually reflect what we hear frequently, both through the PPV, through our own social networks, through FANDAF, that on top of moving to a new area, which involved a new house, new school, new social groups, there's also a whole new medical support structure to set up, which Emma alluded to. She's going to, after years, she's going to have to move and set up a whole new structure. And as she said, you know, they have been family to her, as well as having family support, being relatively local to actual family. So it's very difficult for people to do this, and any kind of information or help in telling us what's available and what services can be provided in a new area. They're often not the same, and I think it would be really great to have a one-stop shop. The OnePoint information hub would really save a lot of time and effort for the carer. Any time saved is probably time that might be saved and that might be spent on looking after the carer themselves, because that's another important thing that is just ignored in many occasions. As Alan said, I think a lot of great work has been done recently on identifying carers at both Defence Medical Service practices. I was only commenting in the sidebar that this must be a new initiative, because 3 years ago when I was in Tidworth, as Joe Boyd was saying, nobody asked me if I was a carer, but now people are being asked, and I think that is phenomenally useful and positive. It's not always easy to identify unless there's a box to tick that says you have a caring responsibility. A lot of people don't identify as carers. I think until Paula approached me for that first conference to ask to speak about my carer's perspective, I never considered myself a carer. I'm an unpaid mother of a child, and I was providing care in that way. I've also since then temporarily became a child carer. I looked after my mother when she was unwell for a little while. I didn't do it very well. She died last November, but and in fact, in some ways, I feel I don't care anymore now. I have my son is away at university, so I'm doing distance caring, and my mother's no longer around. But I can still see the importance of giving support to people who do care in any way, as it can be absolutely exhausting and very frustrating. The great data gathering that the survey has done will actually help to carers in many ways. You know, just having information that is often provided to the serving person through the MOD, but they're not always involved in the care in that way. So I think a lot of things will make the journey much smoother. The aspirations are high, and their implementation would help carers massively. And we've seen some good work which has culminated in the launch of Op Courage last week, as well as the previous initiatives to identify veterans through read codes at GP surgeries, and I gather this is being rolled out for families as well. So we look forward to further and better communication and to working together to make life easier for carers, because in some cases it really isn't very easy. And that's what I have to say about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you both very much. Just another kind of extraordinary set of information, and also kind of slightly recurring themes about this recognition piece, this not recognizing, not self-recognizing, not being recognized. And I think that's something that I've certainly like to pick up in the Q&A session afterwards, because it's certainly a fundamental pillar of the new strategy of Carers UK as we move forward in the new financial year. So we're a little bit ahead of ourselves. So what I'm going to suggest is that we go for our break now, and we take 15 minutes. So if we come back at about 2:05, and then we go straight into Paul Watson, who is both recorded and on standby, and then we'll go into our Q&A panel. So I will see you back here in 15 minutes.